Hey there, welcome again to another episode of Speaking of. Today we are speaking of Measure 110. Measure 110, if you live in Oregon, you have heard about it. It's been one of the ballot measures in recent years that has gained a lot of attention. And since it was passed in 2020 and implemented in 2021, it's been under a lot of scrutiny, not just here in Oregon, but around the country. And once again, it's making headline news, and there's been a lot of discussion around this measure, and so it's a big deal. What I want to do here, I want to look at first of all, what is Measure 110? How did we get here? So I'll give you some of the background as to what the law actually tried to do and what it actually did. I want to spend a little bit of time evaluating whether or not the law as it was passed is effective, or was it effective. And then I want to look at maybe some of the underlying issues, or sort of the cultural critique or cultural evaluation. And then I want to look at where do we go from here. So Measure 110, what is it? Measure 110 was passed in 2020 by a margin of about 58% to 42%, which in election and balloting is considered a pretty big landslide. That was a pretty significant victory in favor of Measure 110. It may or may not be relevant, but that was, of course, the election year. That was during the COVID pandemic. And, I always wonder, did the COVID pandemic and the related restrictions and so on, did that have any effect on it? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's kind of a curious thing to wonder about. What the law did, it's sort of a misnomer. It's a common misunderstanding that the law simply decriminalized all drug possession and all drug usage. That's actually not entirely accurate. What the law did do, was it changed the way that state and local government and law enforcement agencies responded to drug use. In effect, there were still penalties for people who were caught using drugs or possessing drugs, but those penalties would no longer put a person in the court system and in jail. They would instead give a person a fine, and the emphasis shifted from penalizing those who were caught with drugs to more rehabilitation, prevention, and treatment. And part of what the law did was it then took the tax that has been collected from marijuana sales, and it took a big chunk of that money and redirected that money into diversion programs, treatment programs, and the like for those who are struggling with addiction. So the law Measure 110 didn't technically decriminalize drugs, or it didn't legalize drug use, but it just changed the way that these sorts of crimes were approached. Essentially, they would not be felonies, they would not result in a person getting jail time, they would no longer result in a person being arrested. And of course, there were stipulations attached to this. So the law did not apply to, say, the person trafficking drugs, from California or Mexico into Canada. It only applied to those cases where drug possession was pretty small. So here's what would happen if you were arrested, if you were caught possessing drugs, or if you were caught doing drugs, even in a public place like on a street corner. You would be assessed $100 fine, and that fine would then be dismissed if you would call a drug hotline, and then you'd go through a drug screening program. So the idea was that a person who's caught with drugs would then, rather than facing any sort of penalty for it, they would actually have the opportunity to be screened for drug use, and then they could be given options for treatment. So then they set up a hotline that a person was supposed to call if you were arrested, or not if you were arrested, but if you were caught possessing drugs. If you were issued that citation, that $100 citation, then you'd call that hotline. But here's the thing, and here's where I think one of the glaring weaknesses in this law is that let's say if you did get cited for possession of a small amount of heroin or cocaine or something like that, and you're issued the citation and you're told to call the number, and then you won't get that citation would be waived. If you don't end up calling the citation, there were no repercussions. Nothing happened. So you could carry on as normal. There was no real incentive for a person to actually change their behavior. And what that meant was, consequently, something when the state just completed an audit of Measure 110, and what they found was that only like 1% of all the people who had received a citation even called the hotline. It's kind of interesting. They found out that the hotline cost, when they factor in the total cost of maintaining this hotline with the number of people that called the hotline, they figured that it cost something like $7,000 per call to run that hotline. And so it became pretty evident, I think, fairly quickly that there were some real weaknesses in this law. Now, the theory, or maybe better to say the goals behind Measure 110, the goals behind changing these laws, was to focus more on treating a person with who has an addiction, treating them as someone who is in need of assistance and in need of help. And so the goal is to reduce the overall number of arrests for drug offenses, and thus remove the pressure on the legal system and the costs and the difficulties associated with that, to relieve some of the burden on, say, public defenders, to relieve the burden on the penal system, and to make it, to focus on making prisons less populated. The stated goal was also to reduce the number of drug overdoses, and by reducing the number of overdoses, to also then provide more options and to promote increase access to service and to help. And so, rather than taking a person who's already struggling with an addiction and all of its related problems, the goal is to try to help that person rather than make their life more difficult. So that was what Measure 110 was all about. That was passed in 2020. It went into law, I think, on mid-February of 2021. It's now almost been 3 years since that law was, I might have my dates wrong. Oregon and Washington had very similar laws that were passed, and they were both passed around the same time. I think it might be that Oregon's law went into effect January 1st and Washington's went into effect in mid-February. In any case, it's been about 3 years since the law has been on the books. And so the question is, has Measure 110 worked? Has it achieved those stated goals of reducing the number of arrests, reducing the number of overdoses, and lightening the burden on the penal system? Well, the data is not very encouraging, actually. But some of the data, it needs a little bit of nuance. First of all, Oregon has, in the entire country, it has had one of the highest rates of increase in overdose deaths in the country. So when you compare the number of overdoses in 22 with the number of overdoses in 2023, Oregon's rate of increase is something like 27%. Washington was slightly higher. I think Nevada was really close in percent when you evaluate by percentage. There was something like 1,600 deaths in Oregon related to known drug overdoses in 2023. That's almost 30% of a rise over the year 2022. So when you look at the overall number of drug overdose deaths, the number has, it would appear that Measure 110 has actually not had any impact at all. In fact, recently, our governor here in the state of Oregon declared a state of emergency I think they called it officially a fentanyl state of emergency up in the city of Portland. They've realized that the number of fentanyl deaths is increasing at an alarming rate, and decriminalizing drugs has not done anything to stop that. And I'm going to say more about that in just a second. But the point is, if you look at overdose deaths, Oregon is in a drug crisis. We have We have the number of people who are doing drugs on the streets and overdosing because of it. And the other thing is too that's worth noting is that the numbers that I just cited are actually from deaths due to fentanyl. That does not include total number of overdoses. And some people know I a lot of times like to listen to the police scanner just here in my office, and it's because it's always kind of curious to hear what's going on. And just 10 minutes ago, there was another call for an overdose in one of our city parks. And so this is, it's Portland, it's Salem, it's everywhere. There's the drug crisis in our state is alarming, and it's something that we really ought to be paying careful attention to. But the question is, and this is where you have to dig a little bit into the numbers, because it's easy to just assume correlation. It's easy to assume, well, fentanyl deaths are up, drug overdose are up, and therefore it's because Oregon decriminalized drugs. It's because of Measure 110. That's certainly a case that a lot of people have made. But the data actually doesn't support a causation relationship there. Now, that doesn't mean that Measure 110 is good, bad, or otherwise. It just means that because there've been a lot of studies done on the effectiveness of Measure 110. Because Washington and Oregon were the first two states to pass such legislation, there've been a lot of organizations, think tanks, and so on studying the effects of Measure 110 to evaluate whether or not it actually works. And what they found, so there was a study that was published in the Journal of American by the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry that actually found no link between fatal overdoses and decriminalization. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, how in the world can that possibly be? How do you have a 30% rise in overdose deaths that seems to correspond to the year that drugs were decriminalized, and how can you not assume a link? Well, the answer is that deaths were already rising to begin with. Overdose deaths were already on the rise in Oregon and in Washington, particularly because of fentanyl. So what they find is that fentanyl enters the market at different times in different places. In other words, if you live in one particular region, fentanyl enters into that particular part of the country, and the effects begin to spread out very quickly. And they can kind of track. What they've done is they can find about an 8-year track where the deaths rise for about 8 years and then sort of plateau and level off. And it turns out that fentanyl entered into the Oregon marketplace, you might say, right around the same time that Measure 110 was passed into law. And so what that means is that deaths, we were sort of already beginning to ride that roller coaster to the top when drugs were decriminalized, when Measure 110 passed. And so, what that means is that Measure 110 did nothing to stop that rise, but it also means that it likely didn't do anything to promote that increase in overdoses, which is a way of saying that sort of nobody wins, because on the one hand, the law it's ineffective on its stated goal of reducing the number of overdose deaths. Decriminalizing does not lead to lower deaths. It just doesn't. But it also, in fairness, it also has to be said that you can't just assume that the drug problem today is a direct cause and effect relationship between decriminalization or passing 110 and where we are today. There was an additional study that was done in the International Journal of Drug Policy that discovered, shockingly, not really, that the number of arrests for drug offenses declined very sharply, which I don't know how else. I don't know, how else to state something more obvious than that. But when you make drug possession a non-arrestable offense, of course you're going to notice a decrease in the number of arrests. And so, in terms of the stated goal of trying to decrease the number of arrests, Measure 110 worked, but that should not be all that shocking. It should not be all that impressive. It really says nothing other than the laws were changed so that you couldn't arrest a person for possession, so people weren't arrested for possession. It's like, yeah, obviously. The bottom line is that The number of deaths has continued to increase. The number of arrests has gone way down. And it seems to me that Measure 110 has spent an awful lot of money, and it's very questionable whether or not the law has actually been effective as it is currently written. Now, my observation, I have a number of observations on this. First of all, I think one of the things that this reflects is the trend towards treating even an addiction as more of a pathology, as more of a sickness rather than a problem of the human heart or the human will. And from a Christian vantage point, I think, on the one hand, I want to say, well, it's good that we should be compassionate. We actually should seek to try to be aware of the whole picture that an individual might be experiencing. We should be sensitive to all of their circumstances, and we shouldn't just automatically send a person to jail because they break a law for having drugs on them. But it also seems odd to me that we simply take a problem like an addiction and we treat it as nothing more than a sickness. We treat it as nothing more than an illness that needs to be medicated or counseled, and we do nothing to hold people accountable for the bigger picture. In other words, a person, drug addiction, it actually has there's a much broader effect on society. In other words, if you begin to have people using drugs in the streets become less safe, less hospitable, less livable. Communities suffer because of it. And there needs to be, in my judgment, there needs to be accountability for that. And I believe that the change in this law actually made that much more difficult. And so it actually did nothing to promote the overall livability of our communities. And sometimes what you have to look at is how do people change their behavior? What is it going to take for a person who struggles with an addiction? What will it take for that person to change their behavior? And sometimes the best thing that can happen is they are put into the system and they have to deal with the consequences. They end up in jail. They end up sort of forcibly detoxing in jail. And hopefully, I believe our jails and our prisons should provide access to treatment programs and should make it possible for a person who wants to get clean and so on and so forth. But I also believe there needs to be accountability for wrongdoing in order to preserve the overall good of society. So there are currently a number of laws that are being considered in Oregon. The Oregon legislative session began this past Monday, February 5th. And for the next 35 days, the legislative session will be meeting, and they've got hundreds of bills that they will be considering related to all kinds of different issues. But Measure 110 is one of the bills that is being is under a lot of scrutiny, and they're looking at ways to improve it. And of course, there are two different approaches. And generally speaking, there are a number of laws that are being proposed by the majority power, which is currently is the Democrat Party, of course. And they are acknowledging in many cases the weaknesses of this law as it's currently written, and they're looking for and they're proposing ways to amend it or to build on it. So their approach on the left, it tends to be, well, this law it's not perfect, but it needs to be tweaked and it needs to be changed rather than torn down and replaced with just going back to the way things were. So the proposals put forward by the Democrat Party in Oregon focus more on treatment, on providing services, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, on the right, a number of people in the Republican Party and a number of actually joint sponsored bills have been put forward to actually reinstate criminal penalties for possession, to hold people accountable, but also at the same time to provide treatment and to provide options and diversion programs so that a person essentially has so what the law would change so that people who are caught in possession of drugs, and certainly those who are dealing drugs, they will receive penalties. They are either, I don't remember what they are, misdemeanors. Some are misdemeanors, some are felony offenses. But what I do like is the option that says it's a diversion program. So it's either jail or it's treatment. You have and there's accountability. There's teeth that are built into that, so that if you don't go to jail, if you don't go to your treatment, you don't complete your treatment, then you will be arrested and you will be held accountable. And I think that seems to be a good option. So what would I do about all this? What do I propose? I'm by far not an expert on drug policy and social policy, but it seems that there's a couple things that I think would be helpful and necessary. The first is this: I think you've got to treat youth and adults differently in these circumstances, because I think for a young person who gets caught up in drugs, there's a higher chance that early intervention will have a positive effect and will allow the person recovery and treatment and help them to sober up and live straight and live clean. So I think, for those who are, 18 and especially, and maybe even 18 to 26, but certainly younger than 18, I think the focus should be much more, you should target them with treatment initiatives that are meant to help break free from addiction. And then as you move into adulthood, I think then the balance has to shift towards accountability and responsibility for their actions, so that adults are, if they've made the choices, at some point they do have to be held accountable. And so then, yes, I do think it makes sense that there would be penalties and even jail time for people who are caught using drugs. It does seem to me, second thing is it does seem reasonable to present treatment as an alternative to jail. In other words, if a person's caught with possession, especially if it's like a first or second time offense, it does seem that providing them the option to go into treatment, and perhaps to an extent at their own expense, that seems that it would be a good way forward to incentivize sobriety and to disincentivize addiction. And that but of course the key thing is there that you have to build into that. You have to build in the accountability to that. You have to hold people accountability for their actions. And that's maybe then the third thing that I would say, which is that I think it is important to prosecute drug use as a crime, especially when you get into people who are repeat offenders, especially when you get into offenses that tend to have detrimental effects on the broader community, when it damages the livability of a community. I think decriminalizing that was a mistake. And I think it is important to put back into the equation fines, jail time, and so on. I think it probably makes sense to hold dealers, those who can be shown to be dealing drugs, hold them accountable with higher penalties and higher fines, because they're the ones that end up fueling the drug crisis, and so you want to hold them to a higher standard, I think, or maybe not to a higher standard, but they deserve to be held accountable because their actions carry greater significance. And then finally, I think, and I've kind of said this already, but I think it's important to incentivize treatment. It's important to incentivize recovery. You have to make that a viable option that a person will desire, rather than just something that, hey, call this hotline and then we'll waive the fine. But if you don't call the hotline, well, we won't do anything about it. I think somehow you've got to incentivize treatment. So, and I think it's especially as the fentanyl crisis is increasing here. Something has to be done. We have to. I do think there is room to be aggressive on, and especially on those trafficking fentanyl. I think I think we should be aggressive in putting a stop to that, and penalizing those, especially those who are more responsible for fueling that crisis. So Measure 110, it'll be interesting to see what happens within our legislative session this year is a short session. It's 35 days. That means I think it's sometime in mid-March that the session ends. I forget exactly when it ends, but sometime in mid-March. It'll be interesting to watch what happens and to see the outcome of this. I think whether we all have maybe different opinions. Many people have different opinions on how to fix the problem, but we all agree that there is a problem, and our shared goal should be doing whatever we can to address that problem. So thanks for joining me today on Speaking Of. Don't forget to like and subscribe, share this with someone else, and we'll see you next time.